In the world of country music, where steel guitars cry and voices tell stories of heartbreak and loneliness, whiskey has often been both a comfort and a curse. For many stars, it was the fuel that inspired unforgettable songs and the fire that consumed them in the end. In this video, we take a sobering look at 12 country music stars who were drunk all the time, exploring how fame, pain, and addiction intertwined in the lives of some of Nashville's Hank Williams Sr. Few names in country music carry as much reverence or as much sorrow as Hank Williams Sr. His songs defined an era and carved the emotional DNA of country itself. From I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry to Your Cheating Heart, Hank's voice seemed to pour straight from the soul of the American South, raw, trembling, and heartbreakingly human. But behind that voice was a man slowly drowning in the very loneliness he wrote about. Born in 1923 in Mount Olive, Alabama, Hank grew up surrounded by poverty, pain, and a mother who pushed him hard to perform. Music became his escape, but it also became a source of endless pressure. By his early 20s, he was already famous and already dependent on alcohol to keep his body and spirit together. Chronic back pain from spina bifida, relentless touring schedules, and emotional instability drove him to the bottle more often than not. When Hank drank, there were two sides of him. The first was magnetic, charming, hilarious, and full of wild energy that captivated anyone near him. The second was destructive, a man who slurred his words, missed shows, and burned bridges across Nashville. Musicians who played with him often recalled nights where he could barely stand on stage, his cowboy hat tilted low as he tried to remember the next verse. The Grand Ole Opry, the institution that had once celebrated him, eventually banned him because of his drinking and unreliability. His marriage to Audrey Williams collapsed under the weight of constant fights and betrayals, many of them fueled by alcohol. Yet in the middle of this chaos, Hank somehow continued to write songs that cut straight to the heart. His pain, raw and unfiltered, became his art, and that art became immortal. By the end of 1952, Hank was a broken man at just 29 years old. He checked into hotel rooms with bottles instead of friends, playing gigs when he could and drinking when he couldn't. On New Year's Day 1953, he was found dead in the back seat of his powder blue Cadillac with an unfinished song in his hand and morphine and alcohol in his veins. The autopsy called it heart failure. The truth was simpler. His heart had carried more sorrow than one man could bear. Hank Williams Sr. didn't just die from alcohol. He lived through it. His music remains a haunting reminder that sometimes the same fire that gives a man greatness can also be the one that burns him away. 2. George Jones. If Hank Williams was the tragic poet of country music, George Jones was its wounded soul, a man whose voice could break your heart even before you understood the words. Known simply as the Possum, Jones turned pain into melody better than almost anyone in Nashville. Yet behind every trembling note was a life torn apart by alcohol, chaos, and lost chances. Born in 1931 in Saratoga, Texas, George Glenn Jones grew up poor and restless. His father drank heavily, often coming home violent and unpredictable, leaving scars that never healed. Music became George's refuge, and by his teens he was already performing on the streets, singing with the kind of sorrow that only someone familiar with suffering could express. But even as his career took off, the shadows of his childhood followed him closely, in the form of a whiskey bottle. As fame grew in the 1950s and 60s, so did his dependency. Jones would disappear for days, cancel shows, and destroy hotel rooms in drunken rages. Nashville insiders began calling him No-Show Jones because audiences never knew if he'd show up sober or at all. His third wife, Tammy Wynette, became both his greatest love and his most painful chapter. Their turbulent marriage, filled with both passion and violence, was soundtracked by some of the most unforgettable duets in country history, including Golden Ring and We're Gonna Hold On. But offstage, alcohol tore them apart. One story from his early years became legendary. After Tammy hid the car keys to stop him from buying liquor, George famously drove his riding lawnmower 8 miles down the highway to a bar. That single act, reckless, funny, and sad, came to define him. A man who would literally crawl through hell for another drink. By the 1970s, his addiction nearly killed him. His weight plummeted, his performances became erratic, and many believed he wouldn't survive. Yet somehow, redemption found its way to him. After years of battling the bottle, George sobered up in the 1980s, guided by his fourth wife, Nancy Sepulvado, who refused to give up on him. He began rebuilding his career, releasing hits like He Stopped Loving Her Today, a song so haunting it was almost prophetic. George Jones lived to 81, but his voice carried every scar of the life he'd led. When he sang, you could hear the baroom echoes, the regret, and the lingering tremble of a man who'd seen both heaven and hell. Alcohol may have chased him for decades, but it never silenced him. In the end, he sang his way through the darkness, and somehow found grace on the other side. How about a 3? Johnny Paycheck. If country music ever had a poster child for self-destruction, it was Johnny Paycheck, the outlaw who lived every lyric he ever sang. His voice was sharp, his presence defiant, and his life a roller coaster of rebellion, whiskey, and regret. Known for the 1977 blue-collar anthem, Take This Job and Shove It, Paycheck rose from the rough bars of Ohio to the bright lights of Nashville, only to fall back into darkness, dragged down by his addictions and his own wild temper. Born Donald Eugene Lytle in 1938, he had a natural gift for music. By his 20s, he was already playing bass and guitar for country greats like Farron Young and George Jones, absorbing the spirit of honky-tonk life along the way. But fame didn't come easy. For years, he drifted between labels and stage names, performing under different identities before finally reinventing himself as Johnny Paycheck. A man tough enough to sing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. That truth was soaked in alcohol. Paycheck was rarely sober on or off stage. Whiskey fueled his confidence and destroyed his discipline. Bandmates recalled him drinking before sunrise and stumbling through rehearsals. Still, his voice, gritty, powerful, unfiltered, carried an authenticity that fans adored. Songs like Slide Off Your Satin Sheets and I'm the Only Hell My Mama Ever Raised became anthems for working-class rebels who saw their own struggles reflected in his chaos. But behind the outlaw image was a man spiraling out of control. Paycheck's drinking led to countless bar fights, arrests, and bankruptcies. His temper was infamous. In 1985, after years of heavy drinking, he shot a man in the head during an argument in an Ohio bar. He claimed self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, serving nearly 2 before being released. The man who once topped the charts was now an inmate, haunted by his own lyrics and the sound of closing cell doors. When he got out, Paycheck tried to rebuild. He returned to the stage, older and worn but still proud. He found religion, gave interviews about redemption, and admitted that alcohol had been both his companion and his curse. But decades of abuse had already taken their toll. His health deteriorated rapidly, and by the late 1990s, he could barely perform. Johnny Paycheck died in 2003 at the age of 64, his life a country song come true, loud, messy, heartbreaking, and unforgettable. He once said, "If you can't live it, don't sing it." And he lived every note until the end. Proof that the line between performance and pain in country music can be heartbreakingly thin. Few stories in country music are as devastating as that of Keith Whitley, a man whose voice carried both the tenderness of love and the ache of slow destruction. He wasn't just another country singer. He was the promise of a new generation. His songs were pure emotion, his delivery hauntingly sincere. Yet beneath the charm and talent was a man losing a lifelong battle with alcohol, one drink at a time. Born in 1955 in Sandy Hook, Kentucky, Whitley grew up immersed in bluegrass. By the age of 15, he was already performing alongside Ricky Skaggs, impressing even legends like Ralph Stanley with his maturity and soul. Everyone who heard him knew he was destined for greatness. When he transitioned to mainstream country in the 1980s, his smooth voice and heartfelt lyrics made him an instant star. Tracks like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All revealed a rare emotional honesty that set him apart from his contemporaries. But as the applause grew louder, Keith's inner demons became harder to hide. Friends recalled how he could down an entire bottle before noon and still sing flawlessly by nightfall. His drinking wasn't about partying. It was about pain. He struggled with anxiety, perfectionism, and a deep sense of isolation that success only magnified. Even his wife, country singer Lori Morgan, who loved him fiercely, couldn't save him from himself. She once described his drinking as a darkness that lived inside him. By 1989, Whitley was at the peak of his career and on the brink of tragedy. He had just released Don't Close Your Eyes, which was climbing the charts, and industry insiders saw him as the next George Strait or Randy Travis. But the bottle had become his constant companion. On May 9th, 1989, after a night of heavy drinking, Keith was found unresponsive at home. The cause? Alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol level was 0.47, nearly 5 times the legal limit. He was only 33 years old. His death sent shockwaves through Nashville. Artists like Alan Jackson, Tim McGraw, and Garth Brooks would later cite him as a major influence. Fans mourned not just the loss of a voice, but the loss of what could have been, a career that was just beginning to bloom. Lorrie Morgan's heartbreak echoed through her later performances, her songs forever tinged with the grief of losing the man she called the love of my life. Keith Whitley's story is one of beautiful tragedy, a man whose songs taught us how to love deeply, but whose demons wouldn't let him stay. He sang with a heart full of truth, and that truth, as haunting as it was, became his legacy. 5. Merle Haggard. If there was ever a man who embodied both the rebellion and redemption of country music, it was Merle Haggard. His life read like a Southern novel. Poverty, prison, pain, and a long road toward grace. Known for classics like Mama Tried, Okie from Muskogee, and The Bottle Let Me Down, Haggard was as rugged as the landscapes he sang about. But that same bottle that gave him his greatest songs also nearly destroyed him. Born in 1937 in Oildale, California, Merle came of age during the Great Depression, raised in a converted train boxcar by hard-working parents who struggled to survive. When his father died suddenly, the boy who would one day be called the poet of the common man fell into rebellion. By the time he was 20, Merle had been in and out of juvenile detention, then prison, for robbery and petty crimes. But music saved him. Inside San Quentin prison, he saw Johnny Cash perform, a show that changed his life. From that moment, Merle Haggard vowed to turn his story around. When he emerged from prison, he poured his pain into songwriting. His songs weren't polished. They were real, raw, and filled with the truth of a man who'd lived it. But with success came temptation. As the fame and pressure of Nashville life grew, Haggard leaned heavily on alcohol to numb the weight of his past. He drank before shows, after shows, and sometimes during them. In interviews, he admitted that he could never quite escape the loneliness that had followed him since childhood. His drinking didn't just affect him, it wrecked marriages and friendships. His second wife, Bonnie Owens, who was also one of his backing vocalists, tried to help him stay sober, but the road and the bottle were stronger. At his lowest points, he would disappear for days, lost in a haze of whiskey and guilt. Yet, every time people counted him out, he clawed his way back with music that was brutally honest. Songs like I Think I'll Just Stay Here and Drink became both confession and anthem. In the 1980s, Haggard found a fragile peace. He slowed down, got sober for stretches, and began reflecting on the cost of his lifestyle. He said later in life, "Whiskey took a lot from me, but it also gave me a window into who I really was." His rawness, his refusal to hide his flaws, made him an icon. Even when he wasn't sober, he was real, and that honesty connected him to generations of fans. Merle Haggard passed away in 2016 on his 79th birthday, a poetic ending to a life that had been anything but easy. By the end, the whiskey glass was empty, but his songs remained full of grit, regret, and grace. He proved that redemption doesn't mean perfection. It means surviving long enough to tell your story. 6. Waylon Jennings. Few figures in country music lived as hard, or as honestly, as Waylon Jennings. A founding father of the outlaw country movement, Jennings rejected the polished Nashville sound for something rawer, truer, and deeply personal. His songs were about freedom, defiance, and the price of both. But behind the swagger and the leather jacket was a man constantly wrestling with addiction, loneliness, and the ghosts that whiskey brought to life. Born in 1937 in Littlefield, Texas, Waylon grew up poor but determined. By his teens, he was already a radio DJ and a skilled guitarist. His life changed when he befriended Buddy Holly, who took him on tour as a bass player. That friendship nearly ended in tragedy. Jennings famously gave up his seat on the plane that crashed in 1959, killing Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson. The guilt from that night haunted him forever. He later said, "I felt like I gave my seat to death." After that, Waylon's relationship with alcohol deepened. It was a coping mechanism, a constant companion on endless nights of touring. By the late 1960s, as he fought against Nashville's strict recording system, he began drinking more heavily. Whiskey to ease the pressure, to dull the creative frustration, to fill the silence of hotel rooms after the lights went out. He found success on his own terms, releasing rebellious, whiskey-soaked anthems like Luckenbach, Texas, and Are You Sure Hank Done It This Way? But as his fame exploded, his addiction spiraled. Waylon didn't just drink. He combined alcohol with cocaine and amphetamines, pushing his body to the brink. His friends described nights where he'd down a bottle of Jack Daniels, pop pills, and still be writing songs at 4 a.m. He became one of the hardest living men in country music. A symbol of rebellion and destruction rolled into one. Yet on stage, no one could touch him. That deep, gravelly voice and unshakable stage presence made him magnetic. His second wife, Jessie Coulter, stood by him through the chaos. Together, they were the outlaw couple of country music, fiery, passionate, and broken in all the right ways. But even love couldn't save him from himself. Years of drinking caught up with him in the 1980s. His health deteriorated, his finances crumbled, and he finally decided to quit cocaine and cut back on alcohol. It wasn't an overnight miracle, but it was the beginning of a long, painful redemption. By the 1990s, Jennings had turned reflective. He still drank occasionally, but the fury had faded. He spent his last years mentoring younger artists and telling hard truths about fame and survival. When he died in 2002 at 64, the world mourned not just an outlaw, but a man who had lived his songs without compromise. Waylon once said, "I may be crazy, but it keeps me from going insane." His life was proof that for some legends, whiskey isn't just a vice, it's part of the rhythm that keeps the music alive. Top 7. Tanya Tucker. Among the outlaws and heartbreakers of country music, Tanya Tucker stands out as one of the few women who lived life just as hard as the men and survived to tell the tale. She was a prodigy, a teenage superstar whose voice carried the grit of someone far older. But behind the fame and the glitter of the 1970s country scene lay years of struggle with alcohol, loneliness, and the crushing weight of growing up too fast in a world that never stopped watching. Born in 1958 in Seminole, Texas, Tanya was just 13 when she recorded Delta Dawn. The song became a national sensation, turning her into one of the youngest stars in country music history. By the time most kids her age were worrying about high school dances, Tanya was touring the country, surrounded by adults, lights, and liquor. Her management pushed her hard. Long tours, endless press, and the pressure to stay relevant in an industry that quickly devours its own. Alcohol was everywhere, and soon it became her way of coping. By her early 20s, Tanya's wild side was infamous. She drank heavily, partied harder, and cultivated a rebellious image that both thrilled and worried Nashville. Her relationships were equally turbulent, none more public than her passionate affair with Glenn Campbell, a man 22 years her senior. Their love story was fiery, glamorous, and often drunk. The tabloids devoured it, and Tanya, still in her early 20s, found herself the center of a storm she couldn't control. Her drinking grew worse after the breakup. Nights blurred into mornings, and her once brilliant career began to wobble. Producers complained about missed sessions, and critics wrote her off as another fallen child star. But Tanya Tucker was tougher than most. When the 1980s arrived, she did what few believed possible. She clawed her way back. Hits like Love Me Like You Used To and Strong Enough to Bend marked not just a musical comeback, but a personal one. Still, the ghosts of addiction followed her for decades. Even in her later years, she spoke openly about her struggles with alcohol, saying it was both her comfort and her curse. What saved her was perspective and time. She learned to laugh at her past, to own it rather than hide from it. Tanya became a survivor in every sense, a living testament to endurance, resilience, and the will to rise again. When she finally won her first Grammy in 2020 for While I'm Livin', it wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. She had faced her demons, outlasted her critics, and turned her pain into art. Tanya Tucker's story isn't just about drinking. It's about a woman who burned brightly, stumbled hard, and still found her way back to the stage, right, stronger than ever. 8. Hank Williams Jr. Carrying the name Hank Williams Jr. was both a blessing and a curse. The son of the legendary Hank Williams Sr., Bocephus, as he was nicknamed, was born into both country royalty and unbearable expectation. From the moment he stepped on stage as a child, audiences didn't just want him to sing, they wanted him to be his father. That impossible weight would drive him toward rebellion, self-destruction, and years lost to the haze of alcohol and pain. Born in 1949 in Shreveport, Louisiana, Hank Jr. had talent in his blood. By age 8, he was performing his father's songs on stage, and by his teens, he was touring full-time. The problem was that Nashville saw him as a tribute act, a shadow of the man who had died before Hank Jr. was even 4 years old. He sang Your Cheatin' Heart and Hey Good Lookin' so perfectly that people applauded the imitation, not the individuality. Inside, that reality was tearing him apart. By the late 1960s, Hank Jr. began to rebel against the clean, traditional image his handlers forced upon him. He started drinking heavily, bourbon, beer, whatever was nearby, using alcohol as both armor and escape. In his own words, I had to drink to forget the ghost I was chasing. Touring nonstop, he became known for hard living, barroom brawls, and unpredictable performances. Then came 1975, the year that changed everything. While hiking in Montana, Hank Jr. fell nearly 500 feet down a mountain cliff, shattering his face and skull. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. It took multiple surgeries and years of recovery to rebuild his features, and when he returned, he was unrecognizable, physically and musically. The trauma only deepened his dependence on alcohol, but it also fueled his transformation. Out of that pain was born a new sound, gritty, southern rock-infused country that broke free from his father's legacy. Songs like Whiskey Bent and Hellbound and Family Tradition didn't just talk about drinking. They celebrated it with brutal honesty. He wasn't hiding his demons anymore. He was turning them into anthems. Fans connected instantly. For the first time, Hank Jr. wasn't living in anyone's shadow. He was his own man, wild, scarred, and defiant. But behind the outlaw image was still a deep struggle. His drinking often spiraled out of control, straining relationships and isolating him from those closest to him. Yet, he never pretended to be clean or perfect. That authenticity, the willingness to show the darkness alongside the glory, became his defining trait. Today, Hank Williams Jr. stands as one of the most enduring figures in country music. He's been drunk, broken, redeemed, and rebellious, sometimes all at once. But through it all, he's carried the torch of both father and son, proving that survival, not perfection, is what makes a true legend. 9. Johnny Cash. There was no one in country music, or perhaps in all of American music, quite like Johnny Cash. His deep baritone, his black clothes, and his honesty made him larger than life. He sang for the lost and the broken because, in truth, he was one of them. Though history remembers him for his battles with pills, alcohol was his first and constant demon, following him from the cotton fields of Arkansas to the brightest stages of the world. Born in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, Cash grew up poor, picking cotton with his family and singing hymns with his mother. Those early years of hardship planted in him both faith and melancholy, a duality that would define everything he wrote. When he rose to fame in the 1950s with Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line, he became a symbol of integrity and rebellion, the man who gave a voice to sinners and saints alike. But behind the legend was a man quietly unraveling. Cash began drinking heavily while touring with Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins during the early rockabilly era. Long nights, endless shows, and loneliness on the road led him to reach for the bottle. It started as a social escape, but soon became a daily need. He drank before shows, between songs, and after curtain call, not to celebrate, but to cope. By the 1960s, whiskey was joined by amphetamines and barbiturates, creating a toxic cycle of exhaustion and addiction. June Carter, the woman who would eventually save his life, met him during this chaotic period. She described his drinking as a battle between God and the devil, fought inside the same man. On his worst nights, he would disappear into the desert or wake up in jail. Once, in 1967, he was arrested in Georgia with a car full of pills and whiskey bottles. He laughed it off publicly, but privately, he was collapsing. Yet even in the darkest days, Johnny Cash remained creative. His pain fueled the raw, confessional tone of his music. When he performed for inmates at Folsom and San Quentin prisons, he wasn't just entertaining them. He was standing among them. a sinner who understood redemption better than most preachers. Those shows became iconic because they were real. A man who had stared into the abyss singing for others who lived there. In the late 1960s, with June's help, Cash began to pull himself out of the wreckage. He turned toward faith and sobriety, though relapses haunted him throughout his life. He often said, "The Lord saved me from myself more than once." In his later years, when illness and grief took over, he returned to the studio sober but weathered, recording haunting renditions like Hurt that laid bare his lifetime of pain and grace. Johnny Cash's story is not one of ruin, but resurrection. He was drunk, broken, redeemed, and reborn, a man who proved that even through addiction and despair, the truth can still find a voice. 10. David Allan Coe. If country music had a wild card, someone too raw, too honest, and too unpredictable to fit into Nashville's tidy image, it was David Allan Coe. To some, he was a genius. To others, a menace. But no one ever doubted that he lived every line he sang. His life was a storm of rebellion, whiskey, jail time, and raw poetry. While his songs became outlaw anthems, his drinking often made him the outlaw even the outlaws feared. Born in 1939 in Akron, Ohio, Coe's story began in darkness. He was in reform school by age 9, in prison by his teens, and had spent nearly 20 years behind bars before country music found him. There, behind cold walls and concrete floors, he wrote songs about life's ugliest corners: betrayal, regret, and survival. When he got out in the 1960s, he arrived in Nashville not as a dreamer, but as a man hardened by life. He carried his guitar and his demons like twin companions. Alcohol was part of his identity from the start. He drank to celebrate, to fight, to forget. His early shows were notorious, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, always unpredictable. Promoters never knew if they were getting the poet or the drunk. Fans loved him for it. He wore his chaos like a badge of authenticity, striding on stage in leather pants, long hair, and dark glasses, bottle in hand. By the mid-1970s, Coe had become one of the founding fathers of the outlaw country movement, alongside Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Paycheck. But even among outlaws, he was different. His voice cracked with raw emotion, his lyrics unapologetically brutal. Songs like The Ride and Long-Haired Redneck reflected a life that didn't just flirt with danger, it lived there. Whiskey was always nearby, both muse and monster. Those who toured with him tell stories of whiskey-soaked nights that blurred into mornings. He'd drink until his voice turned ragged, then deliver a performance that somehow hit harder because of it. But the cost was steep. His reputation suffered, and Nashville's mainstream industry kept him at arm's length. While others like Jennings and Nelson found redemption, Coe often seemed to dig deeper into isolation. He once said, "I've been my own worst enemy since the day I was born." Still, beneath the chaos was a lyrical brilliance that even his critics respected. His songs were covered by greats like Johnny Cash and Tanya Tucker, and his storytelling influenced a generation of modern outlaw artists. In his later years, Coe struggled with declining health but continued to tour, often with a bottle nearby, old habits dying hard. David Allan Coe's life is the purest definition of the outlaw spirit: talented, self-destructive, unfiltered. Alcohol didn't just follow him, it became part of his legend. He turned whiskey-soaked truth into art and left behind a legacy as complicated and unforgettable as the man himself. 11. George Strait. Early career phase. When you hear the name George Strait, you think of class, consistency, and quiet strength. He's the king of country, a man who defined the sound of modern Nashville without ever losing touch with his Texas roots. But in his early career, behind that calm demeanor and spotless reputation, George fought his own private battles, including a heavy reliance on alcohol that nearly took control before he ever became the legend we know today. Born in 1952 in Poteet, Texas, Strait grew up on a ranch, surrounded by hard work and country values. He joined the Army after high school and married his high school sweetheart, Norma, before being stationed in Hawaii. It was there, performing with the Army-sponsored band Ramblin' Country, that his dream of becoming a country singer began. But even then, the pressures of performing and the loneliness of being far from home led him to the bottle for comfort. When he returned to Texas and began chasing a music career in the 1970s, success didn't come easy. He played small honky-tonks and smoky bars, driving long hours across the desert to make ends meet. The shows were rough, the crowds rowdy, and whiskey was always flowing. Strait once admitted that in those early years, he drank not just to fit in, but to survive the grind. Every night blurred into the next. The drinks before the set, the beers after, and the long drive home through the Texas night. When MCA Records finally signed him in 1981, George was still rough around the edges. Talented but unpolished, humble but insecure. His debut single, Unwound, became a hit, launching a career that would soon define an era. But success only increased the pressure. Touring schedules, media attention, and constant comparisons to Nashville's biggest names left him anxious and restless. Alcohol became both a social lubricant and a way to silence the noise. Band members recall that in those early years, Strait could drink anyone under the table. Whiskey was as much a part of his image as his cowboy hat and crisp smile. Yet even as he drank, he never lost control on stage. The professional mask stayed firmly in place. What few people saw was the toll it took off stage. Nights ended in silence, with a man who felt trapped between the simplicity of his roots and the chaos of fame. Everything changed in 1986 when tragedy struck. His daughter, Jennifer Strait, was killed in a car accident at just 13 years old. The loss shattered him. For a time, he withdrew completely from interviews, public appearances, and the spotlight. Many believe that it was this devastating event that made George step away from alcohol for good. From that pain came focus, and from that focus, greatness. In the decades that followed, George Strait became a model of restraint and resilience, a man who had stared into darkness and chosen discipline over destruction. The quiet cowboy learned to carry his pain not in a bottle, but in his music. Songs like The Cowboy Rides Away and I Saw God Today reflected a man who'd lived through loss and come out wiser. George Strait's story isn't one of ruin, but of redemption before disaster. He proved that even the kings of country have to fight their demons, and that real strength sometimes means knowing when to stop. 12. Hank Thompson. Before the rebellious outlaws of the 1970s or the Nashville superstars of the 80s, there was Hank Thompson, a pioneer who brought sophistication to honky-tonk and turned heartbreak into poetry. But behind the smooth suits and charming smile, he was also a man who lived much of his life with a drink in his hand. For Thompson, whiskey wasn't just a prop of the honky-tonk world he sang about. It was part of his rhythm, his ritual, and, eventually, his reckoning. Born in 1925 in Waco, Texas, Hank grew up during the Great Depression, where hard work and hard liquor were part of daily life. After serving in the U.S. Navy during World War II, he returned home determined to make music his life. His early songs like Whoa Sailor and Humpty Dumpty Heart showcased his clever lyrics and sly humor, helping him stand out from the endless sea of barroom crooners. By the 1950s, he had become one of the biggest stars in country music. Backed by his legendary band, the Brazos Valley Boys, Thompson created a new sound. Danceable honky-tonk blended with Western swing and smooth arrangements. He was one of the first country artists to use twin electric guitars and experiment with studio production, paving the way for generations to come. But as his fame grew, so did the endless nights of touring, parties, and barroom living. Whiskey was part of the scene. Every night, every show, every handshake. Fans expected to buy him a drink, and he rarely refused. What started as camaraderie turned into habit. His friends recalled that Thompson could handle more than most, keeping his composure even after several glasses, but the lifestyle was relentless. The constant travel, the strain of performing, and the loneliness of hotel rooms often pushed him deeper into the bottle. Unlike some of his peers, Thompson managed to balance his vices with remarkable discipline, at least for a while. He was meticulous about his performances, his wardrobe, and his band's professionalism. Yet the years of drinking eventually took their toll. His marriages fell apart, his health began to fade, and the joy of music slowly gave way to fatigue. He once admitted in an interview, "There's a thin line between a good time and a bad habit, and I crossed it a long time ago." By the 1980s, Thompson had scaled back his touring schedule, but he never fully quit drinking. He continued to perform well into his late 70s, charming audiences with stories and songs from a bygone era. Even as his voice aged, it carried the warmth of experience and perhaps the quiet regret of a man who had lived every line he ever sang. When Hank Thompson passed away in 2007 at the age of 82, he left behind more than 50 years of music and an indelible mark on country history. He was a gentleman of the honky-tonk, a pioneer of sound, and a man who knew that behind every Baroom song lies a little truth and a little whiskey. His story closes the circle. From Hank Williams Sr. to Hank Thompson, 12 legends whose talent burned bright, but whose lives were forever shadowed by the bottle.